Welcome, everyone, and let's talk about our next topic, which is the architecture of ages. And of course, I know that you were supposed to read the history of Britain from this period for today. But as I said last time, if you didn't, I'm not going to really find out. Anyway, the reason I'm saying this is that I am sometimes going to mention some historical events or kings or specific issues, and sort of I'm calling out certain facts that were in the textbook, but it's not necessary to know that in order to deal with this. Okay, so before we jump to the Normans, we will talk a little bit about the Anglo-Saxons again. I promised last week that the Normans are coming this week, and it is true, they are coming this week, but obviously they are still not here. And the reason is because if you remember, when last week we talked about the Anglo-Saxons, then we talked about things like the Tara Brooch. We did already talk about the biotapestry, so material artifacts, but we didn't talk about their architecture, whereas we did talk about the buildings in the Iron Age, in the Bronze Age, in the Neolithic. So we should return to this issue of Anglo-Saxon architecture. Another reason why I have this here, besides that we didn't have time for this last time, is that actually our topic is medieval architecture, and this is medieval too, just early medieval. So in fact, if we don't just compare two styles, but three styles, that's actually even better for us. So, okay, what you have on the slide is some basic overview of what we know about Anglo-Saxon architecture. First of all, when it says there mid-5th century to the Norman conquest, that shouldn't really surprise you, right? Because we've already discussed that the Norman conquest started around 450 and lasted for a few hundred years until the Anglo-Saxon conquest started at around 450 and lasted around 200-300 years before they settled down. So this is why mid-5th century, the Anglo-Saxons were not yet there earlier than that. And then the Norman conquest in 1066 and after, because obviously the Norman conquest was not just the Battle of Hastings. So this is more or less the time, or exactly the time period we are talking about. Now, the Anglo-Saxons provided quite a contrast to the Romans. You know, we talked last time about the Romans with their villas, with their fancy spas, with their huge walls, etc. I compared to this, Anglo-Saxons are a bit less advanced in terms of their architecture, and definitely different, because the majority of their buildings were once again timber, so wood, and not built out of stone, which, as you know, is obviously a problem for us in terms that wood doesn't happen to last long. So again, a lot of their buildings we are not even able to see or really talk about. But not only, they did have some brick buildings as well, but compared to the Roman buildings, they were rather simple and more primitive and more and less impressive, but we are definitely going to talk about them. However, we are very lucky, we are in fact extremely lucky, because at least one church built of wood survived all those years, and the Greek church is still there, and we are going to take a look at some photos soon. And I think the main reason why it is good that we have this building built of wood is that if we saw just the ones built of stone, we would imagine the Anglo-Saxons being horribly bad builders. But they were not. They were just amazing at building wooden buildings and not very good at building things out of stone. So we're lucky enough to see how good they were at wood. And why do I say that they were not very good at building things out of stone? Well, first of all, the earliest stone buildings they built without mortar. So we are just talking about stone upon stone upon stone, and let's hope it's not going to fall apart. Obviously, none of these buildings without mortar survived from the Anglo-Saxon period, very probably because of the Normans. You know, there were battles in England and present-day England and Wales. But we have a building, the Galerius Oratory, which is from the same period, maybe. We will talk about it in a second. And built with similar techniques. The only problem is they were not, this is definitely not something built by the Anglo-Saxons, because it's in a relatively far away point of Ireland, and the Anglo-Saxons in that period were not there. So it's probably something built by the Celts, but it actually shows us probably how those very early buildings could have looked. Now, in fact, the later techniques were also heavily influenced by monasticism, so monasteries, and monasteries which they encountered when meeting the Celts, who were there, right? The Romans didn't get rid of the Celts, who were the original inhabitants of the island. They just mingled with them, and then the Romans left. So when the Anglo-Saxons arrive in Britain, they see Celtic buildings and Roman buildings, and Roman culture without the Romans themselves, and Celtic culture. And what is more somehow compatible with the Anglo-Saxon style is not the more advanced Roman one. So they are going to be more influenced by the monasteries of the Celts. So they build heavy walls, strong walls. Often the buildings had very crude finish, and they don't have big windows. Mostly the reason they don't have big windows is that they are not as good builders as to be able to afford big windows. And most of the buildings are not very tall and not very big. So let's take a look. So the left top is the Galerius Oratory, which I say is probably not built by the Anglo-Saxons, but built in the same period. So this is how a building without mortar probably looks like if it is to survive anything. It's more or less just leaving it all to physics and the heavy weight of the stones. Now I say 7th century, 12th century question mark. The reason is if you actually Google this and read anything, even just Wikipedia, you will find out that there is a continuous debate about who built this building and when they built this building since the 18th century. So various scholars find various things about like tiny details and say, oh no, this cannot be from this period because whatever. So it may be a very early building or a very late, relatively late building, but let's believe that it's old. I mean, at least looks simple. Now, when they did build things with mortar, when we are talking about late Anglo-Saxon period, that looks more like this. So, as you can see, it is made of stone. It has very small windows, very thick walls, nothing very fancy. And this is a church, by the way. It doesn't even really have a tower, because that was a challenge. Now, there are some later Anglo-Saxon buildings that do have veiled of stone, and we will see those towers. And so it's not that they couldn't build towers. Now, but if you compare these things with what they could build out of wood, look at this kind of structure here, and it's amazing, you know, that this building survived such a long time. And you know, like if you look at a modern church built out of wood, it wouldn't look very different from that structure there. Okay. So let's talk about the Norman style. And the Norman style is the style in Britain that was the main architectural style in the 11th and 12th centuries. What is interesting is that you would probably say, yes, it's the Norman style, so this style arrived with the Norman conquest, and it's definitely impossible to find anything Norman style on Britain before the Battle of Hastings. It would be logical to say, right? The Battle of Hastings is the first time the Norman conquerors appear, so that's when it all starts. So what would the Norman style do there earlier? Well, actually, if you made this conclusion, you would be wrong. This is not true, actually. The Norman architectural style arrived to Britain before the Norman conquest. Actually, architects from Normandy were to Britain by Edward the Confessor, Anglo-Saxon king, to build churches. You know, the name Confessor was supposed to mean that he was a very religious, a very pious king. So because he was very religious, very much into Christianity, he wanted to have buildings similar to what were built in bigger centers of Christendom. So actually, Westminster Abbey was built before the Norman conquest. And the original Westminster Abbey was a building in Norman style. By the way, the PowerPoint will be also on the e-learning, not just the video, so you don't necessarily have to worry too much about it. I mean, take notes, but don't necessarily over. So, the Westminster Abbey was actually ready in its first version before the Normans arrived. And in fact, if you read the textbook, you find out that the reason William the Conqueror was proclaimed King of Britain was that the reason that he decided to do it in Westminster Abbey was because he wanted to show continuity. So he didn't want to be seen as an outsider, but somebody who continues the tradition that is there. So although I come from somewhere else, I'm the true king. And now, by Norman style is something that you would call this style only in Britain. Otherwise, this is the style that we normally call Romanesque elsewhere in Europe. So, the Norman style in Britain can be especially typically found in terms of ecclesiastic architecture, which means church architecture. So again, churches, monasteries, etc. And to some extent in the form of fortresses and castles. This ecclesiastic architecture, church architecture, has anybody read the textbook already? No problem. Anyway, even if you haven't, if you think about the Middle Ages, you probably realize or have this idea, and it's not an incorrect idea, that this is a very religious period. It is a period when the church had a lot of capital and a lot of land. So they actually were among those few people who could afford to build big, expensive, complicated buildings. And then, of course, the other part of society would be the aristocracy, kings and various feudal lords. So this is one of the reasons why basically talking about churches and fortresses and castles. Another reason in the case of fortresses and castles is that while that there were still a lot of wars. So it's not like the Normans came, occupied everything, and there was one big kingdom, and everybody was happy, but there were still a lot of fights. So in fact, they needed fortresses and castles. Now this is, of course, a robust, heavy, and strong style. And let's take a look at this diagram there. Now, as you can see, if you look at this drawing, for example, we have here arches, several levels. So bottom, middle, and top, but it can be more than 3 even. So these buildings, compared to those tiny little Anglo-Saxon churches, even if wooden churches, but also, and especially if so compared to tiny little churches, these are huge. Although they are huge, they are still relatively simple in geometry. So, for example, this plan, you have the nave and the chancel as one axis, and then the transepts as the other axis, is very typical for Norman churches. And the fact that in the crossing here, where the transept meets the nave and the chancel, that this is where you would find the tower, is also very typical. There are Norman churches which don't have it exactly like this, but this is the most typical. And the reason for this being is that that place is where statically speaking, it is easiest to build a heavy tower without it collapsing or everything, or so it is a stable place to put it. Now, these churches still have thick walls. They still have relatively small windows, but these small windows are much bigger than the small windows of the Anglo-Saxons. They have arches, and in this period, round arches. We will see with the Greek style that that's where pointed arches are becoming the thing. Here it's mostly round arches. And Either we have very simple vaults or we have wooden roofs. At least, especially in the early period, the roof is still wooden. Now, another problem with the Norman style is that buildings built in the Norman style are still hard to find. Not as hard as Anglo-Saxon buildings, but still hard. Any guesses why it is hard to find them? Any ideas? That it is not too easy to find buildings which are in Norman or Romanesque style, or only in these styles.
Because they were rebuilt to more modern and fashionable styles.
Exactly. Perfect answer. Our idea of preserving our historical buildings, that that we have to keep all buildings the way you are, and you are not allowed to put a plastic window in an old building or add a new part, is a conception that originates in the 19th century. So before the 19th century, this whole idea of preserving historical buildings didn't exist. So in fact, what happened is that if you had a church, from time to time they said, oh, we should make it better. So they would add something in a more modern style, or they would rebuild it completely, because that was their idea of doing what is right to do. Always rebuild it into something bigger, nicer, more modern. Now this is one reason why this happened, and this is probably the main reason. But at least in terms of rebuilding Norman churches to Gothic churches, which would be the next style, there is one more reason. And that one more reason is that I just said a few minutes ago that early Norman churches had wooden roofs, not vaults, not stone vaults like the Gothic ones. So that also meant that in the Middle Ages, in fact, there were lots and lots of fires, devastating fires in cities, because they didn't have fire brigades, and definitely not fire engines to put the fires out. So another reason that they didn't survive is that they did burn down, at least the roofs. And once the roof burned down, they needed to build another roof. They didn't want to build a roof again out of wood, so they were also to some extent forced to modernize sometimes. But we are still not completely without hope, because we can take a look at two cathedrals, and the White Tower and the Oakham Cathedral, as examples of Norman style architecture. Now with Durham Cathedral, what is Norman is the main structure, but there are other parts which are in different styles, and we will talk about that. And in Rochester Cathedral there are also tiny little Gothic additions, but it's mostly Norman. Oakham Castle and the White Tower are completely Norman, actually. So let's take a look. So here is Durham Cathedral, and when I said the main structure, then you will immediately see that this is definitely not Norman here, this huge stained glass window, right? When we said that the windows are small. So these huge stained glass windows added are not in the Norman style anymore. They are Gothic modifications. But if you look at these heavy towers, they might even be remains of the Anglo-Saxon period. And even this huge tower is already, of course, Norman, but still. And of course, the main structure. So let's take a look inside, because it will be also very illustrative. So as you can see, this one already has vaults and not a wooden roof structure. But you can see the arches. See? One arch, another arch, another arch. They are not pointed, they are rounded. This part with these fancy Gothic things and the huge rose window is already Gothic. So try to imagine that the rose window is not there and this thing above the altar is not there, but the rest is pretty much what a Norman church would look like. Now, Rochester Cathedral is a better example. As you can see, even what I said about the tower typically being in this crossing appears very nicely. Most of the windows are still relatively small. Well, of course, even here there are a few Gothic decorations, but still quite good example. And here you can see the wooden roof. It is not, ribbed vaulting like we would see in the other churches. And one more thing. Do you see something here which is not what you are used to in churches? Have you ever been to church? Good. Good. Now, what you normally would see in a church where people sit is what? Where do people these days sit in churches? In pews. P-E-W. A pew is this long thing where people sit next to each other. And here, what you see are just chairs. And you know what? This is for a reason. Back in the Middle Ages, there were very, very few pews actually in a church, if any. Because only if there was a pew somewhere, probably if we walked here, we would find one or two here in the sides. They were for the aristocrats or the very rich townspeople. They would have their own pews built for themselves, and they would even lock it, so they would have doors on it, and only they could sit there. And everyday people were just standing or sitting on a rag or brought their own little chair with them. So these chairs are obviously modern, but the reason these very old churches don't have pews is because they don't want to actually add something that would not fit. Okay, now the White Tower, where is this? Yes, that's a part of the Tower of London. And this is important. The White Tower is an example of Norman architecture, but not all of the Tower of London. So again, the Tower of London was built hundreds of years, and something is from this period, but not everything. Now here, of course, you can see heavy walls, small windows, not a fancy looking building. But we have to be careful. The reason this is so much robust and so much heavy walled and small windows is not only because it is a Norman style. What is the other reason that this is? Exactly. We are talking about a prison, so this is intentionally robust. Or, before it used to be a prison, it used to be actually a fortified castle. So at some point the king lived there and prisoners but they really wanted to keep it safe. So, in any case, this looks robust because it had to be robust also. Okay, so Oakham Castle. This is not what you expected when you heard Oakham Castle, right? What does it look like? It looks like a church. Yes. Because you know why the churches look the way they look? Not because there is a sacred, majestic concept of how a church should look like, but those churches look like because that was the only way they could build a big building without it falling apart. So, you know, if they wanted to build anything big, it would always look the same. So, by the way, this is not all of the castle. This is all that remained. So, Oakham Castle originally had several parts, but this is what remained, and this is what is actually the Great Hall of Oakham Castle. So this would be the place where they would do some ceremonies, or where the Lord would meet people, etc., or they would have balls for dancing, but they didn't live in this, because this is just all one big room. So they didn't live in this one big room, it's just that this is what remained. So while you can see that in terms of its shape, it's really similar to a church, except for not having a tower. But one thing that you could see is that we don't have so many. We still have the 3 layers, but it is somewhat smaller, not so fancy, because there was no need for it to be so fancy and so big. Okay, so let's move to the Gothic style. And what we can say for sure about the Gothic is that this is one of those styles which got their name as a rude critical joke about the style. So, if you hear Gothic, and forget about the churches and the architecture, what is the other meaning of the word? And this is funny actually, because it has several meanings, but let's go through them, we have time. So, of course, it can refer to this period of history. But if we say Goth, what do you associate to? Come on, we have time. In fact, I'm going too fast, so we have a lot of time. So let's just talk a bit about the Goths.
You mean the tribe Goths?
Yes, I mean the tribe Goths, although I was secretly hoping that someone will mention the contemporary, or not so contemporary anymore, musical and dressing style, you know, people dressed in black and being very, very sad and listening to depressive music and so on. So that's another meaning of Goth. But okay, yes, the one that we are talking about are the Goths, the tribes, the Visigoths and the other Goths, and you know. So similar to the Anglo-Saxons, the Goths were also, warlike tribes that actually caused a lot of trouble in Europe. They were pillaging, they were stealing, they were robbing, they were raping. I wanted to say women, but we cannot know that they were all heterosexual, so raping whoever they found. So, you know, like these very nice people. And this is why when we say Gothic is originally a degrading term, a rude joke is because those people who named the Gothic Gothic meant it like that. Ah, bloody barbarian crap. And who were those people? Well, those people who named the Gothic Gothic were thinkers of the Renaissance. So from the perspective of the Renaissance, the Gothic looked like this kind of primitive, barbarous, uncivilized something. Because, of course, although the Renaissance comes later, I can tell at least that much already here, that for the Renaissance, the idols, the models were the Romans and the Greeks. So for them, Roman architecture, Greek architecture, that's the thing. And therefore, what was between the Renaissance, which was trying to rebuild something on the model of Roman architecture, and between the actual Romans, for them everything in between those two is barbarian crap. So this is why they named the Gothic Gothic. The funny thing is, though, is that in the 19th century, so in the case of Britain 300 years after the Renaissance, those people had a completely different idea. 19th century cultural revival was thinking about, well, we should think of something that is truly ours. So in Britain, actually, when the 19th century Victorian thinkers will start thinking about what could be the truly British or English at that period mostly style. Well, where are our architectural roots? Then they will say, the Gothic, of course. That's the truly English thing, the Gothic. Norman would be okay, but there is not much Norman remaining. They are saying, yes, those old churches, those old Gothic churches, that's our real style. So in fact, the 19th century's main architectural style, especially in Britain, will be the Gothic revival. So it is really funny how, from looking at it as something uncivilized, it actually becomes the new model. And in fact, for the 19th century, the Roman models and Renaissance would be more like the barbarian thing, because one of the reasons they go back to the Gothic is not just because it's all over the place and this is our history, but also because they say we should find something truly Christian. Because 19th century British architecture should be Christian architecture, not pagan like those Romans were. So for them, this Gothic style will be the model. But let's not rush to 19th century yet, and let's talk about the actual Gothic a bit. And what we can say for sure is that the style starts in the 12th and 13th centuries, depending on where. And actually, if you hear the word Middle Ages and you think of buildings, then this is the most likely association. You're almost certainly going to think of the Gothic as the Middle Ages architectural style, the main style. In fact, to the point that, if you play some computer games, even in some imagined fairy tale Middle Age scenario, they will still have Gothic cathedrals there and all that. And this is actually the dominant style until the appearance of the Renaissance. That is the style that is going to radically change the architectural landscape. However, I do have to make a footnote here, and the footnote is that in countries on the continent, so in Italy, France, Germany, etc., but especially Italy and Germany, or not really Germany at that point, but I mean what is today Germany, it is even more true. So on the continent, the Renaissance architecture even more efficiently takes over. Not so much in Britain. In Britain there is some Renaissance architecture, but actually it doesn't become so overwhelming as elsewhere. And this is, as you are going to see soon, a very impressive style. So buildings that are extremely old, if you enter them, they are often absolutely breathtaking in terms of how complicated, how technologically advanced, how really unbelievably refined and light those buildings are. So, this is the best time to tell you, and I'm not going to show you yet, because now is the time for our little break. So, you know, have a bit of a break, and then we will come back and look at the buildings and talk a bit more about how those buildings look, you know, in terms of arches and all that. Okay, so I can see that everybody is here, and we can continue. So let's take a look about the Gothic style. So I already mentioned, actually, quite a lot of these features while discussing the previous styles, because it was hard not to compare others. So, whereas in the Norman style, the typical arch is rounded, here it is most typically pointed. So, to illustrate, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm really bad at it. And, and you will see it soon. So, yes, now windows are a really, really important style of the Gothic. There are windows, and especially the later Gothic it is, the more windows we have. And towards the end of the period, we have like really huge windows all over the place, really flooding the church with light. Which is, by the way, symbolically amazing, because if you think about the teaching of the church, which says, of course, that Jesus is light and God is light. So, of course, they want the church to be flooded with light. Also, we don't typically have just any kind of windows, but we actually have stained glass windows. So, windows made of colorful glass. And it is actually amazing because stained glass windows are amazingly beautiful. They could have very intricate patterns. But at the same time, stained glass windows are a result of technological problems. The reasons they had stained glass windows is that in the period, throughout all of those centuries, they were not able to make windows like these, where they would have a huge single pane, which would not break, would not have big errors or like notches in it. And so therefore they actually had to make those huge windows out of these tiny little pieces. And there comes the genius. If we have to make them out of tiny little pieces, then we can make those pieces into shapes that would actually look like a rose or like a saint or like anything we want. And we can actually easily put some dye into the glass to make it colorful, especially so because if the glass has a dye in it, it's much harder to see that the glass is actually imperfect. So this is a good way of masking the technological disadvantages in a way that it would make it look nicer. And in the earlier period of the Gothic and in late Romanesque, you would have wheel windows, and then these would develop into rose windows. Both of them, and we will see it soon, are circular, but one of them looks like a wheel with spikes, or it's not spikes, spokes, and the other one is already more abstract. Now both here, unlike in the previous periods, are really thin. Well, in quotation marks. Not thin compared to, let's say, modernist buildings or buildings of what you see in modern cities in terms of prefabs, so not that kind of thin, but compared to anything before, thin. And at the same time, while they have huge windows and the walls are much thinner than ever before, yet the buildings are bigger than ever before. And this is why they need buttresses for support. Because if the building is extremely tall, and at the same time the walls are not very strong, then what can happen is that too much weight would just push the walls to the outside, and it would just collapse. So we need the buttresses to keep the walls from falling to the outside. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the details. So here we have arches, and this is a much better way than my horrible drawings, because here you can see a rounded arch, which would be typical for the Romanesque or Norman, and here you see a pointed arch, which would be typical for the Gothic. And to understand what buttresses are, here you have some buttresses, like regular buttresses, and here you have what we call flying buttresses. Now, basically this is the more advanced technology. They realized that there is eventually, over the hundreds of years, that you don't need to have something holding the wall as a outside column almost all the way. It's enough if you have an arch, and the arch actually holds it at one particular point. By the way, this picture has nothing to do with the Gothic here. It is a buttress, yes. This is not a Gothic buttress. Why? Well, one thing is the plastic windows, of course, but I mean, besides the plastic windows, I'm asking because if you see the difference between these two, it will be a very good way, which almost always works, of actually finding out if something is Gothic or Gothic revival. The material. Brick is usually, or basically never, original Gothic. In the Gothic, actual original Gothic architecture, they would build buildings from stone. Whereas in the 19th, late 19th, early 20th century, they were able to make strong enough bricks to make these kind of structures not fall apart if it is made out of brick. So if a Gothic church is made of brick, it's probably 19th century or later, and if it's not, then it's going to be with a much higher chance original. Okay, so some windows, and this is what I was talking about. A wheel window looks actually like a wheel, not these days so much, but if you think of old chariots or old wagons which had their wheels out of wood, then they would have these wooden spokes, the axis in the middle, and then the actual part where it was rolling. It looks almost the same. And then, with further and further developments, they would turn into something like that, which resembles more a flower than a wheel. Now, by the way, if you are saying, yes, that is all fine, but this doesn't look like this and this doesn't look like this, yes, you're right. These windows are not the same, but this is a wheel window, and this is a wheel window, and this is a rose window, and this is a rose window, just not the same. So these are not the inside views of those examples. Okay, so the last thing to discuss about the Gothic are some actual British examples. And we are going to look at 3 examples of ecclesiastic architecture this time, and 2 examples of, well, I would want to say non-ecclesiastic architecture. So basically, examples not directly related to the church, but I'm a bit in trouble with this. Because yes, you can say, yes, those 2 are, of course, the last 2 are, of course, university buildings. So we could say, of course, good, not church buildings. Yes, but divinity school, right? So theological faculty, that's pretty church-like in the period. And if you actually read about the history of both Oxford and Cambridge, although these are both from Oxford, then you would find out that actually both of those 2 universities were founded by the church and not by the king, like many other old universities elsewhere. So, like, if we are really taking ecclesiastic architecture in a narrow sense to include only church building and monasteries, then indeed these 2 are not ecclesiastic buildings. But if we take anything related to the church to belong to that category, then I couldn't find you a single example of Gothic which would not be somehow related to the church. And the reason, or there are several reasons probably, but one of the reasons that occurs to me is that, well, of course, given that we said a lot of things about the Gothic architecture, but all of those things that we said about the Gothic architecture were full of light, thin walls, extremely beautiful structure. This is perfect for a church because a church is there to impress the believers. But it is not very good for a castle. For a castle, it is better to build in the Norman style, even in the Gothic period, because you want it to survive cannonballs. Churches in the Gothic style are not exactly cannonball proof, because if you destroy the buttresses, it might actually collapse, for example. So this is why it is especially church style, the Gothic. Okay, so Salisbury Cathedral here. Now this is early Gothic, and you can easily see that this is early Gothic because, first of all, the tower is still at the typical Norman position. Second of all, there are relatively big windows, and there are a lot of them, but not extremely excessive. And also, we have some buttresses here, but not flying buttresses. And in a way, if you look at it, it doesn't look so extremely different than the previous cathedrals which were Norman. If you go inside, though, you can already see that the whole thing is more complex. And we actually have, well, it's not extremely well visible in this picture. Yeah, it is in the middle. That we already have pointed arches. These are also pointed, just the angle actually doesn't make them look as pointed as they truly are if you were in front of them. The reason I chose this, however, is something else. If you look up to the vaulting, what do you see there? Paintings, colorful paintings. And I really want to talk about that a bit. Because most typically, if you go into a Gothic cathedral, you don't see any paintings on the ceiling or on the columns. Usually you find those in Baroque churches. And because of that, people often think that all this color and illustrations and colorful patterns appear in the Baroque, but it's not true. In fact, all Gothic churches were heavily decorated, extremely colorful. So not only the windows were colorful, but the whole interior would be colorful. The problem is that those colors disappeared. So we are not normally used to this, but they would have been colorful. And there are two reasons for the colors no longer being there. And again, this is the time when I'm going to ask a question. What do you think those two reasons are why colorful decorations and ceiling paintings and wall paintings disappeared from Gothic churches? What two reasons can you imagine? Could have been, so you mean just like destroying the pigment, but no. I mean, yes, in the sense that, yes, you are right, that one thing could be the natural deterioration, indeed. It can be sunlight or temperature or whatever, or, like not having a painter to repaint it and just whitewashing it, etc. So yes, that's one of the two reasons, that it's just simply old, and very few things survive long if it's painted on a wall and not on a canvas. And the other reason, however, is more interesting, because that's a cultural reason. And that has to do with the Reformation. Not so much with Luther, although Luther was not extremely fond of paintings of saints, but especially the Calvinist type of the Reformation, which is, by the way, the type of Reformation that especially influenced the British Reformation. So the Church of England was more influenced by Calvin than Luther. And then, of course, the Scots were even more Calvinist. For them, the Church of England was not Calvinist enough. So this has to do with the idea that for the Protestants, it is actually sacrilegious to paint the saints or even Jesus himself, because they consider this as idolatry. Praying to a picture is not praying to God. It is like the pagans do. So in fact, Calvinism and some other forms of Protestantism would actually go and systematically destroy these things. They would destroy holy paintings, they would remove all the decoration from the walls, and they would say, no, this is all just taking our attention away from the message, and the message is what is in the Bible. And this is all just barbaric and sacrilegious, and this behaving like the pagans. And the reason that didn't happen to the Baroque is because the Baroque was, at that point already, Catholic Church's reaction to the Protestants. So, those churches were built exactly for convincing the average person who was not educated that come to these churches because we are full of, beautiful art, and this is, if you look up, God directly looks down on you, and the angels and all that, and wow. So originally these churches were trying to do the same, but they were just forced to remove them in many cases. Not with this. Here you have some of it. And this will also be interesting in terms of the 19th century Gothic revival, because 19th century Gothic revival buildings are full of red and green and gold and all that. And often when people go to Gothic revival buildings, they feel like, this is so kitschy, this is so over the top, this is like, I want real Gothic buildings. The funny thing is that often 19th century reconstructions are not very close to the original, but in this case they are right. So those buildings, those original Gothic buildings would also be full of red and gold and green and all that, and just that it was removed or destroyed or both. So interesting. And this is why I like this church, because it shows that the Gothic style almost basically naturally develops from the Norman style, because this is so similar to a normal church, and this is an early Gothic. But also because it still has some of those paintings. And also it's not very visible now in the projection, but you will see at home that these arches are, decorated in red, green, and gold. Which would, of course, by the way, have symbolical meanings in terms of biblical symbolism, but let's not go into that now. Okay, so here is a later Norman church, but this is extremely interesting. Look at that tower. What do you say about that tower? Based on what we just said about these architectural styles that we looked at, which style would you put this tower in if you have a church?
You mean the tower?
The tower, yes. So forget about the rest. Okay, imagine this is not here. Which? Gothic, Norman, Anglo-Saxon? Which? Well, maybe the top. But the rest, up to at least this level, this is actually Anglo-Saxon. And not only just looks, it actually is. So this church is another example of, modernizing. So this church's origins are in the Anglo-Saxon period, and then they added and rebuilt. So this here is extremely Gothic, but and these are of course flying buttresses here up at the top, not too visible because of these tiny little towerlets, but that it is there. But even this tower is actually much older than the rest of the building. Okay, so however, if we look inside, you can see that the vaulting is quite amazing. It's extremely detailed, extremely fascinating. I just love it. I cannot hide that I like the Gothic style. But anyway, this vaulting is the longest uninterrupted original Gothic vaulting in the world, not just in Britain. So all the other cathedrals are Gothic cathedrals are either smaller, or they had to, make some reparations on it, or just do something to the original. Okay, cool. And did I forget again one of my examples? Yes, St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle I forgot to attach to the PowerPoint. So let's instead look at the Oxford Divinity School. And as you can see, in some ways, it is quite similar to how the church buildings look, because again, we have buttresses, again, we have multiple layers, but not so many, right? So it's actually much less of a tall building, and also it's just smaller, less impressive in some ways. But also, if you look, there are even more windows. So even more windows, even more light, but not painted, not tinted glass. And the reason for this is a school building. So, I mean, right now, obviously, this is a place where they only do ceremonial things, but originally, they would actually sit here and read. So obviously, they needed a lot of light, more than for seeing the priest. So colorful, tainted glass windows would not actually be very useful. So, but imagine studying at a university which has buildings like this, because they are still using these things. You could, for example, get your degree at a place like this. I mean, that would be quite something. And here is another example, also at Oxford, Magdalen College. This I only have from the outside. And this is actually a cloister here. Cloister is not klášter, it's a false friend. Cloister in English means that part where around a garden you could walk inside a building under arches, which may actually be at a monastery. Not always, like here it is absolutely not. It is something that happens at a university building. Okay, so I hope that you liked my examples of the Gothic architecture. I promise that I'm not always going to talk about architecture, although I love talking about architecture. And I think it's important because in the textbook you read about the kings and the battles and all that, but I think it helps a bit to imagine all those periods if you see what kind of buildings there were. And I also consider it a part of sort of basic common knowledge, to be able to look at a building and say, okay, this is probably from this period, etc. But next time it's already going to be different. Next time I'm going to start talking about my absolute favorite period, besides modernism, and that is the Renaissance. So I will have the opposite problem as today. I will probably want to tell you so much that we might spend maybe even 3 weeks talking about the Renaissance. But I will not talk that much about architecture, although also, but we will also talk about humanism and the roots of this whole thing in Italy, and what kind of ideals it had, etc., etc. And also we will talk about important Renaissance thinkers and writers in Britain. However, not so much about their specific contents of their works, So obviously you have your seminar where you read all those texts. And yes, by the way, what you see on me is actually a diagram showing Dante's Inferno. So, for medieval times it's actually quite topical, although obviously he wasn't British, but still. Yes, so thanks for coming. We finished a bit earlier, and see you in a week.